no one noticed her. That was the point. A mute girl, trained not to be seen, standing on a wooden floor soaked with footsteps and regret. A man raised his hand. The price was barely spoken. 15 cents. Not for a life, for silence. He thought he bought a broken slave. What he actually bought was proof that the system had already stolen his daughter. And the worst part? By the time he recognized her eyes, the law said she wasn't his child. She was property. This story doesn't begin with love. It begins with erasure.
The room smells of dust and old sweat. Not the sharp kind, just the tired smell of people who have been waiting too long. Boots scrape across wooden planks. Chains clink softly, almost politely, as if they're trying not to make a scene. Somewhere, a man clears his throat. Someone else coughs. And in the far corner of the auction house, barely noticed, stands a young girl who does not speak. Imagine that for a second. She's small, too small for the work they expect from her. Her hands are thin, her dress hanging loose like it belongs to someone else. Her eyes don't meet anyone's gaze, not because she's shy, but because she's learned that meeting eyes invites trouble. She is known here only by a single word written in chalk on a slate: mute. 15 cents. That's what the man pays for her. And that, right there, is where this story begins. You see, Charleston, South Carolina, in the year 1860, was a city that breathed contradiction. Salt air off the harbor mixed with the smell of tobacco and iron. Churches stood tall, preaching mercy on Sundays, while auction blocks stayed busy the rest of the week. People went about their lives convinced that this was simply how the world worked. Normal, necessary, God-ordained, some said. The man who stepped forward that day didn't come to buy a child. His name was Thomas Bell. He was in his early 40s, shoulders stooped not from age but from disappointment. Life had a way of doing that to men like him, men who once had something to lose and then lost it anyway. He wore a coat that had been patched more than once. Not poor exactly, but not comfortable either. Thomas had come to the auction house looking for labor, cheap labor. His small carpentry business was failing, and the price of able-bodied men had climbed beyond what he could afford. He told himself he was doing what he had to do, that this was survival, that it wasn't personal. And then he saw her. No one else wanted the girl. A slave who couldn't speak was considered broken merchandise, useless. She couldn't be trained easily, couldn't be shouted at, couldn't respond to commands the way overseers liked. Some whispered that she was slow, others said she was cursed. The auctioneer barely tried. 15 cents, someone muttered, more as a joke than a bid. Thomas hesitated. He hadn't planned on buying a child, but 15 cents was almost nothing, and maybe, he thought, she could sweep floors, carry water, sit quietly in a corner and stay out of the way. He raised his hand. The gavel fell. Just like that, the girl belonged to him. Now, here's the strange part. When Thomas stepped closer to inspect what he had bought, the girl finally looked up, and for a brief moment, just a flicker, something passed between them. Something familiar, a tightening in his chest, a feeling he couldn't name. He ignored it. People ignore feelings like that all the time. He signed the papers, took the chain from the handler's hand, and led the girl out into the sunlight. She walked beside him without resistance, her steps light, careful, like someone used to disappearing. As they walked, Thomas tried speaking to her. Simple words. Come here. Stop. This way. She didn't respond, but you could tell she listened, by her eyes. At his small workshop on the edge of town, Thomas gave her a corner to sleep in, a thin blanket, a piece of bread. He told himself he was being kind, kinder than most, at least. He even gave her a name, Eliza, because he didn't like calling her girl. She never corrected him. Days passed. Weeks. Eliza worked quietly, efficiently. She swept sawdust, carried scraps, mended cloth. She never spoke, but she hummed sometimes, softly, almost unconsciously, old melodies that sounded older than her. And every time she hummed, Thomas felt that tightening again, because he had heard those melodies before, years ago, in another life.
You see, Thomas Bell had once been a family man. 20 years earlier, he had been married to a woman named Margaret. She had a laugh that filled rooms and a habit of humming while she worked. They lived modestly but happily, and when their daughter was born, Thomas had cried harder than he ever had in his life. They named her Clara. Clara had Margaret's eyes and Thomas's stubborn chin. She loved to hum, even as a baby. It soothed her. Margaret used to say she had music in her bones. Then came the fever. It swept through Charleston like a thief in the night. Children were hit hardest. Doctors did what they could, which wasn't much. One night, Margaret fell ill. Within days, she was gone. Thomas barely remembers the funeral. What he does remember is holding Clara, 3 years old and burning with fever, while the world collapsed around him. He remembers begging God, bargaining, promising anything. Clara survived, but something was wrong. When the fever broke, she no longer spoke. Doctors said it might return, that sometimes children just stopped and then started again. Thomas waited weeks, months, years. She never said another word. And then, one afternoon, she disappeared. Thomas had left her with a neighbor while he worked. When he returned, the house was quiet, too quiet. Clara was gone. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, just gone. People whispered. Some said she'd wandered off. Others said she'd been taken. Thomas searched for months, then years. He posted notices, asked questions, followed rumors all the way to Savannah and back. Nothing. Eventually, the searching became unbearable. So did the waiting. Thomas sold the house, left that part of town, tried to build a new life on top of the ruins of the old one. He told himself Clara was dead. It was the only way to breathe. Back in the workshop, Thomas watched Eliza more closely now. The way she favored her left foot when tired, the small scar near her eyebrow, the way she flinched at raised voices but not at sudden noises. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the shop fell quiet, Thomas found himself humming one of the old melodies, without thinking. Eliza froze. Then, slowly, she joined in. The harmony was perfect. Thomas felt dizzy. He asked her, gently this time, where she was from. He spoke slowly, clearly. She looked at him confused, then shook her head. He asked how old she was. She held up 10 fingers, then hesitated, added one more. 11. The numbers didn't match. Clara would have been 23. Thomas laughed at himself that night, a bitter, embarrassed laugh. Grief does strange things to a man, makes him see ghosts in living flesh. But the feeling didn't go away. It grew. One afternoon, Thomas noticed something else. Eliza had been tracing letters in the sawdust with her finger. Careful, deliberate. She could write. That wasn't common. He brought her a piece of paper and charcoal. Slowly, patiently, he wrote his name, Thomas. He pointed. She nodded. Then she took the charcoal. Her hand shook as she wrote, C-L-A-R-A. Thomas couldn't breathe. The room felt too small, too bright, too loud. He pointed to the word, then to her. She nodded again. Tears ran silently down her face. Now this is where it gets complicated, where the past and the present collide in ways that make no sense at all. Because Eliza,
Clara was not 11. She had been told she was. After she was taken, sold, moved from place to place, her age had been rewritten again and again. Her voice, already fragile, had disappeared completely after a beating meant to teach her obedience. She learned quickly that silence kept her alive. Thomas sat on the floor and wept like a child. He pulled her close, afraid to let go, afraid she might vanish again if he blinked. She touched his face, tentative, as if asking permission. For the first time in 20 years, Thomas said his daughter's name out loud, and for the first time in 20 years, she heard it. But love didn't fix everything. There was a problem, a massive one. By law, Clara was his property, and by law, he had no proof she was his child. Freeing her would raise questions, dangerous ones, questions that could end her sold away again, or worse. Thomas spent sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, listening to Clara breathe from the corner of the room. The world outside their door was still the same cruel place it had always been. He began planning in secret.
He taught Clara to read better, to write more. He told her stories of her mother, showed her the locket Margaret used to wear, something he'd kept hidden all these years. Clara recognized it immediately, clutched it like a lifeline. They practiced a new language together, one of gestures, looks, half smiles, a way of speaking without sound. In late 1860, rumors of war filled the streets. The city buzzed with talk of secession, of honor, of defense. Men gathered in taverns, arguing loudly about states' rights and northern aggression. Thomas saw opportunity in the chaos. If the world was about to tear itself apart, maybe he could slip through the cracks. He contacted an old friend, a Quaker, who still believed in the dangerous idea that all people were people. With forged papers and a carefully planned journey north, Thomas and Clara left Charleston one cold morning before dawn. They didn't look back. The road was long, terrifying, full of near misses and silent prayers. Clara never made a sound, but her fear was loud enough for both of them. When they finally crossed into free territory, Thomas collapsed to his knees. For the first time, Clara laughed. No sound came out, but the joy was unmistakable. They settled in a small town where no one asked too many questions. Thomas worked with his hands again. Clara learned quickly. She wrote letters, kept journals. Her voice never returned, but her words were powerful. After the war, after slavery fell, after the world tried to forget what it had done, Thomas told anyone who would listen about his daughter, about the auction, about the 15 cents. Most people didn't want to hear it. Stories like this made things uncomfortable. But Clara lived a long life. She taught children to read. She married a man who learned her language of silence fluently. She had children of her own, children who knew exactly where they came from. And when Thomas died, old and finally at peace, Clara buried him with her mother's locket in his hands. So here's the thing. History likes numbers, dates, laws, declarations. But history is also built on moments like this. A look held too long, a melody remembered, a name written in dust, a man who bought a mute slave for 15 cents and discovered he had been searching for her his entire life. And maybe the hardest truth of all is this: love survived in a place designed to crush it, not because the system allowed it, but because people, broken and scared and flawed, refused to let go of what made them human. That's the part we're meant to remember, even when the world tells us not to. And even after Thomas was gone, even after the ground closed over him and the years kept moving forward like they always do, Clara would sit sometimes in the quiet of the evening and think about that auction house, not because she wanted to relive it, but because it reminded her of something important.
You see, memory doesn't work the way we expect it to. We think the worst moments are the ones that stay sharp forever. But for Clara, the sharpest memory wasn't the chains or the shouting or the way people looked through her like she was furniture. The sharpest memory was the moment her father looked at her and didn't recognize her. That split second, that tiny pause. Because in that pause lived everything slavery tried to steal. Not just freedom, but identity, connection, the simple truth of who belonged to whom. And Clara understood something most people never do, that silence can be louder than screams. After they settled in the North, Thomas tried, awkwardly at first, to be a father again. He didn't know how. 20 years of grief had hollowed him out, turned him cautious, careful, afraid of loving too loudly. He would hover near doorways, watching Clara write by the window, unsure if he was allowed to interrupt. Sometimes he would forget himself and start speaking to her the way he once had when she was small. Then he'd stop mid-sentence, embarrassed, apologetic. But Clara never minded. She read his lips. She read his eyes. She read the regret in the way he held his hands together, twisting them when he thought she wasn't looking. They developed rituals. Every morning, Thomas left a short note on the table before going to work. Nothing poetic, just simple things. Back by dusk. Bread on the shelf. Proud of you. Clara kept every single one, folded carefully, tucked into a small wooden box. And sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet and the world outside felt far away, Thomas would talk anyway. He would sit by the fire and tell stories about Margaret, about Charleston before it broke his heart, about Clara as a child chasing fireflies in the yard. He knew she couldn't hear the sound of his voice the way others could, but he also knew she heard him, and that was enough. Now, let's talk about something uncomfortable, something history often smooths over. Thomas was not a hero in the way stories like to package heroes. He had lived in a slave society. He had benefited from it. He had participated in it. He walked into an auction house and raised his hand. That truth never left him. There were nights he woke up shaking, the image of Clara standing on that floor burning behind his eyes, not because he bought her, but because someone else could have, because 15 cents was all it took. He tried to atone in quiet ways. He helped others escape when he could. He donated what little money he had to abolitionist causes, but he never pretended that good deeds erased bad systems. Clara, in her journals, wrote something once that historians would later quote, "I do not forgive the world for what it did to me, but I choose to live anyway." Those words matter, because too often stories like this get wrapped in neat bows, a reunion, a miracle, a happy ending. But healing is not a straight line. Clara struggled. Loud noises startled her. Crowds made her chest tighten. She avoided mirrors for years because she didn't recognize the woman looking back, the woman shaped by hands that never loved her. And yet, she learned joy slowly, deliberately, like someone testing ice before stepping fully onto it. She loved gardens, loved the way plants responded to care instead of cruelty. She said, through writing, that watching something grow without fear felt like rewriting the past. When she married, she chose someone patient, someone who never rushed her, someone who understood that silence wasn't absence, it was language. They named their first daughter Margaret, and Thomas cried again. When the Civil War ended and news of emancipation spread, celebrations erupted across towns and cities. Bells rang, people danced, speeches were made. Clara didn't celebrate. She sat at her desk and wrote names, as many as she could remember. Faces, places, fragments of lives lost to paperwork and property records. She said freedom meant nothing if memory died with it. That's the part history rarely tells you. Freedom doesn't end the story. It starts a different one. Years later, a young man,
an aspiring writer, came to interview Clara. He had heard whispers of her story and wanted to capture it before time erased the details. He expected anger. He expected bitterness. What he found instead was clarity. She wrote to him, slowly, deliberately. "I was sold for less than the price of a meal, but I was never cheap." Let that sink in for a moment, because that sentence carries generations inside it. When Clara passed away, her journals were donated to a small historical society. They sat mostly unread for decades, too uncomfortable, too personal, too revealing. It wasn't until much later, long after the people who defended slavery were gone, that her story resurfaced. And even then, some people tried to soften it, to focus only on the reunion, to turn it into a feel-good tale about fate. But fate didn't walk into that auction house. A broken system did. And love survived not because the system allowed it, but because it failed to kill it. So when you think about this story, don't just think about the miracle. Think about the cost. Think about the years Thomas and Clara lost, the birthdays missed, the bedtime stories never told, the way silence became armor. And then think about what survived anyway. A melody, a name written in dust, a father who recognized his daughter not by her voice, but by her soul. Because sometimes history doesn't shout. Sometimes it whispers. And if we don't lean in close enough, we miss everything. And maybe the most haunting part of Clara's story is this: how close it came to never being told at all. Because for every Clara who was found again, there were thousands who weren't. Children who vanished into ledgers and shipping records, names crossed out, ages altered, identities erased so completely that even memory struggled to keep up. Clara understood that. She carried it with her like a quiet responsibility. In the years after Thomas's death, she became something of an anchor in her community. Not loud, not famous, but steady. When newly freed families arrived in town, confused and frightened and unsure of where they belonged, Clara welcomed them. She helped them write letters to lost relatives, helped them sound out names they hadn't been allowed to keep. Sometimes, when a mother would break down sobbing because a child never came back, Clara would simply sit beside her. No words, just presence. Because she knew what it meant to be taken, and she knew what it meant to be found. There's a moment described in one of her later journals that stays with anyone who reads it. She writes about standing in a marketplace years after the war, watching children run past her, laughing, shouting, alive. And she writes this: "I wonder who I would have been if I had been allowed to stay." That question doesn't have an answer. And maybe that's the point. Slavery didn't just steal labor, it stole futures that never got the chance to exist. People talk about lost generations, but they rarely talk about lost possibilities. The songs never sung, the inventions never made, the ordinary lives that could have been extraordinary in their own quiet ways.
Thomas, too, lived with that question. Even in freedom, even with Clara beside him, he wondered who she might have been if he had been there, if he had held her hand longer, if he had come home earlier that day. Guilt doesn't disappear just because the story turns out better than expected. It softens, it settles, but it stays. One winter evening, not long before his death, Thomas handed Clara the wooden box where he kept her mother's things. Inside was the locket, a few faded letters, and something Clara had never seen before: a scrap of paper, yellowed with age. It was the original missing notice Thomas had posted all those years ago. Lost, a child, female, mute, answers to the name Clara. Clara pressed the paper to her chest and cried, openly this time, without shame, not because it hurt,
but because it proved something she had always needed to know. She had been looked for. She had been missed. And that knowledge matters more than people realize. After Thomas passed, Clara continued telling the story, not as a spectacle, but as a warning. She spoke through writing at schools, churches, and small gatherings. She refused to let people turn her life into a comforting myth. "This was not destiny," she would write. "This was damage." And still she believed in telling it, because silence, she knew, was dangerous when chosen by others, but powerful when chosen by yourself. In her final years, Clara walked with a cane and wrote more slowly. Her hands, once so careful and precise, trembled, but her mind stayed sharp. When asked what she wanted people to remember, she didn't write about pain. She wrote about recognition. "The moment my father looked at me and saw me, not a slave, not a mistake, not a price, that moment gave me back my name." And maybe that's the lesson history keeps circling without ever fully grasping. Systems can rename you. They can number you. They can sell you for less than the cost of a meal. But they cannot erase who you are, not completely. Not if even one person remembers. Not if even one name survives. So when you hear stories like this, don't rush to the ending. Don't cling only to the reunion, the miracle, the relief. Sit with the silence. Sit with the loss. Sit with the uncomfortable truth that this happened not once, but millions of times. And then remember Clara, a girl who lost her voice, but not herself. A father who found his child in the last place he ever expected to look. And a story that asks us, quietly but firmly, what we choose to see and what we choose to ignore when humanity is put up for sale. Because history isn't just about what was done, it's about what was survived. And sometimes, if you listen closely enough, it's about a whisper that refuses to disappear. And so, when everything else is stripped away, when the dates blur, when the names fade, when the arguments about history grow loud and defensive, this is what remains. A father standing in an auction house, thinking he is buying labor, not knowing he is about to confront the deepest wound of his life. A daughter, standing in silence, trained by cruelty to disappear, not knowing the man in front of her once carried her on his shoulders and promised to keep her safe. 15 cents. Not because her life was worth that little, but because the world around her had decided it could measure a human being that way. And maybe that's why this story lingers, not because it's rare, but because it forces us to face how fragile recognition really is, how easily love can be separated by paper, by laws, by lies told often enough to sound like truth. Clara never got her voice back, but she got something else. She got her name. She got her history. She got the proof that even in a system built to erase, someone had searched for her. Someone had remembered. And Thomas, flawed, broken, shaped by the same world that hurt her, learned that redemption doesn't come from grand gestures. It comes from seeing clearly, from choosing responsibility over comfort, from refusing to look away once the truth stands in front of you. That's the part that still speaks to us now, because the question this story asks isn't about the past. It's about us. Who do we fail to recognize today because it's inconvenient? Whose silence do we mistake for absence? And how many lives are still being measured, quietly, by the wrong standards? History doesn't need us to feel good about it. It needs us to feel honest. So remember Clara, not as a miracle, not as an exception, but as a human being who survived something the world should never have allowed. Remember that love endured where it was never meant to, and remember that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that were never allowed to be spoken, but still manage to be heard. Because as long as we tell these stories, as long as we sit with them instead of turning away, the silence doesn't win, and neither does forgetting.